The Federal and SR Public Welfare Trust present the Pudukkottai Marathon 2025. This event is co-presented by Rupee Apex Group of Companies on Sunday, August 3.
15 months of almost non-stop Israeli bombardment. Somewhere around 55,000 people are estimated to have been killed. Whatever happened to the non-violent strand of resistance that was once seen as an option to achieve an independent Palestinian state? The resistance was by and large non-violent. This would typically include peaceful protests, marches, civil disobedience, and refusal to adhere to laws imposed by Israel. But why did it not take off as the preferred method? Welcome to the latest episode of the Federal's Worldly Wise, a weekly video show that unboxes trending international issues. The occupied Palestinian territory of Gaza is in shambles. 15 months of almost non-stop Israeli bombardment has left it in ruins. Somewhere around 55,000 people are estimated to have been killed in the relentless Israeli assault following the Hamas attack on October 7th, 2023. Amidst all the violence, killings, and destruction of humongous proportion, one question that has been forgotten is whatever happened to the non-violent strand of resistance that was once seen as an option to achieve an independent Palestinian state? The world's media has almost always focused on violence to Israeli occupation in the Palestinian territories of West Bank and Gaza. The PLO and its umbrella constituents, including the Fatah, Islamic Jihad, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or the PFLP, from the 1970s onwards. Much later, in 1987, the emergence of Hamas and its violent struggle against occupation. What is not as well reported is a parallel movement that is non-violent in its methods. Violence against the Israeli occupation surged after the Six-Day War in 1967. But prior to that, the resistance was by and large non-violent. This would typically include peaceful protests, marches, civil disobedience, and refusal to adhere to laws imposed by Israel. Mahatma Gandhi, as also Martin Luther King, had a big influence on a section of Palestinians preferring to adopt non-violence as the tool of resistance. But why did it not take off as the preferred method compared to the mode of violent resistance? According to Palestinian activists, writers, and academics, Israel viewed non-violent protests as more dangerous and came down heavily on them. But to use violence against non-violent protests is indefensible. And Israel reportedly used disproportionate violence against non-violent protests. In fact, in 1988, this reached absurd heights when Israel viewed as a threat an attempt by Palestinians in the West Bank town of Beit Sahour to set up their own dairy farm. The Palestinians were attempting to break their dependence on Israeli commodities for their basic use, like milk. The people of Beit Sahour somehow managed to buy 18 cows from an Israeli settlement and started to distribute milk and related dairy products from there. This act of independence irritated the Israeli government, who ordered the Palestinian residents of Beit Sahour to shut down the dairy farm. The cows were hidden from view and the dairy farm continued its operation. Eventually, Israel sent in troops and managed to halt the Palestinians from running the dairy farm. They were quoted as saying that they saw the dairy cows as a threat to Israeli national security, no less. This story has been captured beautifully in a documentary titled The Wanted 18 by Amar Shomali and Paul Cohen. In some ways, the Palestinian resistance using the cow resembled Mahatma Gandhi's Dandi March and the Salt Satyagraha during India's fight for independence against the British Empire. 1988 was in fact the time when the first Intifada or uprising broke out against Israeli occupation, and the dairy experiment was part of this peaceful resistance. The non-violent protests were organized to mark 20 years of Israeli occupation of West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem following the 1967 war. The Palestinian resistance including the boycott of Israeli products, non-payment of local taxes en masse, demonstration, and marches, among others. The Intifada was considered successful, but it did not become the template for future resistance. But it forced Israel to hold talks with Palestinian groups. The resulting Oslo Peace Accord in 1993 raised hopes of a full-fledged Palestinian state in the next 5 years. The Intifada fizzled out amidst this hope. The Oslo Accords may have only managed to divide Palestinian society rather than bring in a viable solution. Israel's policy towards non-violent protests was brutal. Under its policy called Iron Wall, which prioritizes violent response against any form of Palestinian resistance, Israeli troops put down the protests violently. According to reports, during the first 2 years of the Intifada, some 500 Palestinians were killed, 7,000 were injured, and 50,000 were arrested. Among the positive spin-offs, the first Intifada changed international perception of the conflict. Israel, which was hitherto considered the more vulnerable player, or David, against the mighty Arab threat or Goliath, saw the tables turned with the Palestinians becoming David and the Israeli becoming Goliath. The Intifada also saw independent people's groups from the Palestinian areas and from Israel joining hands to work for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Many Israelis refused to serve in the military in the mood for peace that existed at that point. In 2000, a second Intifada broke out when the then Israeli contender for prime ministership, Ariel Sharon, provoked Palestinian sentiments by visiting the holy Haram al-Sharif, where Jews are historically banned from entering. But the second Intifada was not as successful as the first. It began when Palestinians protested against Ariel Sharon's visit. In response, Israeli troops killed 6 protesters and injured over 200 in firing. Though there was an attempt to keep the Intifada non-violent, some Palestinian armed groups used violence, including suicide bombings, against Israeli targets, triggering off a bigger, more violent response to the Intifada. Media reports said Israel, among other things, used helicopter gunships, tanks, missiles, targeted assassinations, and collective punishment. During the course of the Second Intifada, by the year 2005, some 3,240 Palestinians and 950 Israelis, including soldiers, were reportedly killed. Interestingly, Israel did not tone down its response to the non-violent actions of the Palestinians. In a case documented by Human Rights Watch, a Palestinian activist, Abdullah Abu Rahmi, in 2010, was sentenced to 1 year in prison and a fine of 5,000 Israeli shekels for taking part in a non-violent protest. What the Human Rights Watch found disturbing was that the imprisonment and the fine were based on mere allegations by a set of youngsters who later even withdrew them. But this is one micro example of what happens to an activist who believed in nonviolence, but it also gives an idea about the severity of Israeli punishment to peaceful demonstrations and other forms of nonviolent protests. With the mixed results from the Second Intifada that ended in 2005, the nonviolent stand of the Palestinian resistance did not get the kind of following that activists expected. Worldwide, too, the non-violent form of protest did not get the kind of leverage or attention that may have helped it dominate the narrative. However, there have been spin offs like the BDS movement, short for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, that stems from the non-violent strand of Palestinian resistance. In an attempt to counter it, Israel promulgated the anti boycott law that threatened to impose severe penalties, including jail terms for those supporting it. In the US, which backs Israel to the hilt, at least 37 states have followed suit with similar laws that penalize residents and companies who support the BDS movement and boycott Israel, including products manufactured there. But the BDS movement, alternating between active and sluggish phases, continues undeterred. Overall, the Palestinian non-violent movement, and particularly the Intifada, managed to publicize Israeli occupation and separate the current situation from the history of oppression suffered by the Jews. In other words, it attempted to show that the opposition to the Israeli state was not the same as being anti Semitic. The non-violent movement has enabled empathy for Palestinians among influential sections worldwide. It also kept at bay the worst of Israeli oppression. But all this changed on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas's violent attack gave Israel the excuse it was looking for to decimate Palestinian society. The Netanyahu government's bloodletting in Gaza is not yet done. When the assault stops, whenever that is, a fresh assessment will have to be made on what is left of Palestinian resistance, taking into account the new ground reality in Gaza and its impact on the West Bank. Thank you.